Appreciate it. And we're always trying to improve when we're catching people attempting to attack a site. So hopefully you'll see those messages fewer and fewer. Um, Wonderful. My name is Sam Ray. I'm director of product here at Cloudflare. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to talk about our journey to zero trust. And one distinction I really want to make here is that Cloudflare provides zero trust services to our customers, but what I'm not going to talk about is the kind of sale or commercialization of those zero trust services. What I'm going to talk about is our experience with those with our own journey to a zero trust model. So if we go to the next slide, a quick note about Cloudflare. You might have seen us, like our host here, uh, providing a CAPTCHA or some kind of checking your browser to see if something's going on. But generally, what Cloudflare is a massive global network. And we're actually in 250 cities now. This has changed since we put this presentation together. We provide security and performance services to some of the largest websites in the world, but also to some of the largest organizations and companies. We are the network that they plug into so that they deprecate their corporate network. If we go to the next slide. And you can see one really unique thing about Cloudflare is that we're everywhere. We sit within about 100 milliseconds of about 99% of the humans on Earth. And all the services that we build run in every data center so that we can put security and performance closer to the user. Next slide, please. And one thing to take a step back and kind of realize is that if we were going to deliver security to 10% of the Fortune 1000 to literally millions of websites around the world, we have to make sure that Cloudflare is secure. And if we go to the next slide. And years ago, when I started at Cloudflare, keeping our edge, keeping our data centers and our software secure involved a virtual private network, which many of you might be familiar with. But if you're not, what that means is you build a private version of the internet. And that's something like security. Because what a lot of organizations rely on that VPN to do is kind of mimic the physical walls of a building. If you think about decades ago, we're all in the same building. The data center is really just the room in the basement where all the servers are living. And so we have this little private network inside of the building. And it's great because to be on that private network, you probably have to get past security on the front door, plug into an Ethernet cable somewhere in the building. And that's how security worked. And suddenly people started to leave the office or they needed to connect to other data centers. In our case, data centers in 250 cities around the world. And how was that solved? With a virtual private network. So when I left that office, I poked a hole back into that private network. And from there, I could maybe connect to all these different data centers or these resources that I needed. And that works pretty poorly. If we go to the next slide. Because when I'm connecting to a data center where the VPN concentrator lives, it's a security problem, but it's not necessarily a performance problem. It's a security problem because VPNs work a lot like if you can imagine living in your flat or your apartment building, and because someone can get into the front door of the building, they can walk into any apartment unit. And that is not how any of us want to live in our apartment building, right? We want individual and unique locks on every door. But VPNs, virtual private networks, by default, trust everyone, which is where this term zero trust comes in. Because what these networks should be doing, and what Cloudflare's network does now for our customers and our own internal users, is we trust nothing, right? We have zero trust in anyone. We force every connection and every request to prove who they are or to prove they're coming from a corporate device, to prove what multi-factor method that they used. But again, if you're connecting just to one destination, it's only a security problem. If you're connecting on to other destinations, if we go to the next slide, it's a performance problem. Because if we're, say, in our Singapore office our San Francisco office, and we want to connect to a data center in Singapore, we're going to the San Francisco VPN, and then we're going all the way across the ocean to Singapore. We're adding an extra hop, backhauling that traffic. If we go to the next slide. Because that became a real burden as an organization. So we're running this private network, controlling huge chunks of the internet infrastructure, all through these small physical appliances in a handful of our offices around the world. And as we grew our offices and we grew from just a few hundred people to now thousands of employees and team members, this became untenable. If we go to the next slide. Because not only were we growing as an employee base and a team, we were adding data centers and services all the time, which meant suddenly we were worried about how do we build IP access control lists and how do we make sure that people are able to log in with SSO if at all possible. And it's really became a spaghetti mess from both a performance, but much more concerning, a security perspective. If we go to the next slide. And of course, users just hate it. Most VPNs are the bane of how users do their jobs. It's something that's really difficult to use on a mobile device, on an iPad. It's something that on your desktop does strange things to your routing tables and might cause and introduce problems if you're trying to build something else. So if we go to the next slide. And again, most importantly, our security team hated this model. Because what they really wanted was that zero trust model I was describing earlier, where every door has not just a lock, but a bouncer standing in front of it, checking your ID, checking to see if you're allowed on the guest list into the destination where you want to go. So if we go to the next slide. So how do we square this? This is what a traditional deployment might have looked like. You connect to that VPN appliance, and this might look similar or familiar to you in your organization or historically in your organization. And from there, you connect to one of many services in that private network. Next slide, please. So, all right, we've got this traditional deployment. Users hate it. Most importantly, our security team hates it. And we run a global network. What do we do if we can take that global network to build a zero trust solution for our organization? How do we use that zero trust solution to solve these problems that we have as a team? And most importantly, we want user experience to improve, not just to be less bad. We want this to be seamless for everybody. Next slide. So the first wave of this was rolling out SSO because zero trust really is a journey. So if you're moving from a private network model or just a different type of security model to a zero trust model, there's multiple steps in the journey. And for many organizations, ourselves included, that starts with SSO. So that starts by bringing in something like Azure AD or Okta or Ping, G Suite, you name it, the SSO provider of choice into each individual application that you're connecting to, which for your users means they only need to worry about one set of credentials, right? The credentials they use to log into Microsoft 365 also authenticates them into Jira or Workday. But for you as an organization, it also is much more secure control. Because if, for example, you need to offboard somebody or someone's laptop got stolen and you want to roll their credentials, you can do that from one place. Next slide, please. Layered on top of that, again, it's a journey to move to this zero trust model, is the introduction of things that add new signals of security. For example, you want to go beyond just password authentication, adding multi-factor, especially if you want to add physical multi-factor keys, really the pinnacle of security. Next slide, please. But we still had challenges. And again, the title of this presentation and what our host mentioned earlier is mistakes or lessons learned in the zero trust model. We still ran into issues as, again, this was years ago. We began tinkering with this model and making these security improvements. And one of those issues was the configuration on a per application basis of different security rules. Next slide, please. So how do we take a zero trust approach to SSH and HTTP security to solve that problem of that last slide of going beyond just SSO, but into who's able to connect to what and how do they have to authenticate? And how do we bring SSO to non-HTTP use cases? So most people deploy SSO only for web apps or maybe a handful of other services. But if you think about it, some of the most sensitive resources in your organization are the machines and the servers that run your business. Next slide, please. So here's where we built Cloudflare Access. This was an internal tool, an internal project years ago that was really taking our network as a kind of as that zero trust bouncer, but also using it to introduce the ability to connect through something like SSH or RDP, non-HTTP connections that are enforced with zero trust controls. Next slide, please. So the way that it fits is when a user attempts to reach anything, whether that is a web application, internal or a SaaS application, whether that's a server that they are connecting to over SSH, it's a code repository that they're attempting to reach, where they're making an SSH connection there as well, they hit Cloudflare's network first. And because our network was and still is in so many cities around the world, we put that security and performance closer to our own employees, which meant that for our employees, the experience was that much better. When they hit that network, though, we ran through all those zero trust controls. Whether they were authenticating into something like an admin tool or into one of those servers that's running and powering the edge of our network, we were enforcing all of these rules from identity groups to hard key methods. Next slide, please. And we were adding it to SSH because then we had a single SSH gateway. By single, I mean the same security stack, everything is getting logged, but it's deployed globally. So we're improving the experience for all of our team members, our engineers who are connecting to these destinations. And we're using the SSO identity from their identity provider to authenticate and authorize them into the server itself. Next slide, please. And it wasn't always perfect. Next slide. When we were rolling this out, we introduced problems for our users. When this was an internal prototype, we knew that, hey, sometimes this is going to be a little rocky, and that's okay. This is our first piece of advice, first lesson learned about this experience, where if you want to get to this zero trust model, there's occasionally going to be a little user friction. This is a new experience for most users. Ultimately, it's going to make their experience that much better, but it takes a lot of selling and encouragement inside of the organization to say, hey, this is going to improve the user experience. More importantly, it's going to improve our security model. And yet, we're going to go through a little bit of pain rolling this out. Next slide. So this really is our path to a zero trust model and something that we would encourage and recommend all organizations to think about. We start with a prototype that solves our own problem. If you are not running a global network and building software to secure that global network, we recommend just starting with a tool off the shelf, whether it's Cloudflare's tool or a competitor's tool. Again, this talk is not about selling you on Cloudflare. This is about our experience with this journey, because ultimately a safer internet is a better internet for everybody. So regardless of how you approach a zero trust model, please just do it. And in our case, it meant that we were building this small product to use Cloudflare to secure Cloudflare, ultimately killing our VPN and now helping our customers do the same thing. Next slide, please. So what have we learned? First and foremost, ignore the hype. You probably have heard the term zero trust or SASE dozens, if not hundreds of times right now. And none of it necessarily means what we think it means, right? These are all kind of buzzwords or hype terms that maybe introduce confusion or hopefully some excitement. But what's really important is focusing on the problem that you have. Instead of the hype and the excitement of this new phase of digital transformation, just take a step back and ask, what problems does my security team have? What problems do my users have? Because ultimately, a zero trust model shouldn't just meet the hype criteria, it should actually solve these problems. That's the most important thing for an organization. The next is SSO. If we can go back a slide, please. The next is SSO. In this case, what we think is really important is bringing identity into every user flow. Because ultimately, that allows you to segment your applications, to audit and log who's able to reach what, and have a least privilege access control model, where rather than the entire organization being able to reach this particular resource, let's take a step back and think, who needs access to it? Let's build rules that way. Number three is including infrastructure. And we see this a lot when we talk to friends and other customers. They start this zero trust model and they only focus on, these are known web applications. But like I mentioned earlier, they're leaving some of the most important resources in their organization vulnerable on a virtual private network. So we really encourage everyone, and this is something that we made a huge priority inside of Cloudflare, to think about every resource in your organization, the servers that you're running, the containers that are running, the applications as well, and bringing zero trust control to everything. Because until it's deployed to everything, you're still going to have some potential vulnerability. And again, you don't need to deploy it all one big bang. We recommend taking this kind of journey, this phased approach, but that journey needs to target everything eventually. And then finally, this is again part of the journey. A lot of organizations deploy SSO and then begin to move to a zero trust model. And they just start by saying, hey, anyone in my organization can reach these resources. And that is better than the VPN model that they're replacing. The VPN model was based on IP allow lists. Now you have identity in the mix and logging. This is a great step forward. And that's a good way to begin the journey without introducing too much friction. But over time, we really recommend people to make those groups smaller and smaller, make those rules more and more granular. so that you're ensuring this, again, least privilege access control over everything in your organization. And this isn't on the slide here, but what we really think about when we encourage organizations to move to this model and when they seek our advice on how best to do it is just think about it as something that is both improving the performance and the security of your organization. It's something that can transform your organization and make, quite frankly, the lives better of everyone, every admin from the IT team and the security team across your organization. We think about the zero trust journey as the end goal is really to help people sleep better at night and go home early. Because instead of worrying about the private network and maintaining it, instead of worrying about the security models and challenges introduced by a private network, instead of worrying about the users calling into the help desk about their VPN or other issues with the old security model, everyone's able to just put those aside, trust your zero trust vendor and trust your zero trust deployment, and focus on doing what you do best, the reason you run your business. Next slide, please. So 15 minutes is pretty short. I hope that's been a helpful introduction on what we here at Cloudflare learned about rolling out a zero trust model, the journey that we went on. I'm happy to answer questions. I believe some of our contact materials here in this summit. Please don't hesitate to reach out or say hello. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Be happy to chat.